First of all, I wanted to thank Rhonda and the partners here at SAVE, not only for convening this conversation and continuing this conversation every day, but also, and not only for your amazing work, Rhonda, and not only for keeping survivors and prevention before our communities here in Oregon, not only for all this, but for eloquently reminding everyone who can hear and everyone who can perceive that intimate partner violence and gender-based violence is not an issue nor a symptom of a social ill, but the first thing to be addressed if we're ever to experience any kind of justice or kindness or hope in our society. And I say this because there are no social ills that are unrelated to intimate partner violence or gender-based inequity. I also say this because for those of you who either hopped or stepped or crawled out of bed like I did today, you're the gift that is healing the communities, that is helping to address the trauma, to touch the earth itself and bring hope to children and to the child within us all. You're what we live for. No matter what anyone else tells us, we're not one-issue people. Intimate partner violence is not an issue. Doing prevention involves every part of us and will transform every, quote, issue from an isolated social problem to a network of strength and justice as we address. For there's not only an intersection between oppression and inter-partner violence, but there are also deep and powerful connections between prevention and metamorphosis of individual, community, and society. And Rhonda, SAVE embodies this passion, this hope, this dance. So thank you, and thank everyone for being here today and all that you bring. Today we will discuss the broken, and I would prefer to say shattered, family law, family court system, because shattered implies a little more danger. It's harder to clean up something that's so shattered. How is it possible that children are placed at greater risk of abuse and even murder once their mother finds the courage to leave her house or her abuser? This is a particularly tragic reality which I've been reflecting on for many years. There was a short time before I represented survivors in tort when I was an attorney in California that I did a little bit of family law there. And I came away convinced that the current standards by which custody issues are decided are so antagonistic to children as to be medieval in their concepts. They create an illusion of caring for children, but generally reinforce gender power dynamics, obviously favoring men. No revelation to anyone here, but taking part in this reality was an exercise beyond futility. It was more like science fiction. Science fiction because words change their meanings. For instance, male entitlement occurs in the name of gender equity and protection for children. The standard often referred to as best interests of the child, the standard in California, equates to anything but a child's interests. Generally in adversarial situations occurring due to interpersonal or gender-based violence, the parent with the greater resources drives the conflict. Best interest standard creates a dynamic wherein rewards are readily available to whomever is more skilled at depicting their former partner in the most negative light. And generally, the person who does that better is the person who has experienced the least amount of harm in the relationship. Paradoxically, real situations or abuse are sometimes tragically and offensively viewed by the court as examples of name-calling and lack of cooperation. Survivors are not given credit for telling the truth. Years later, I'm here and director of the Wesley Foundation at the university, and I get to work with students, and I get to work doing a lot of prevention work, also as Safe Sanctuaries coordinator for the Oregon-Idaho Conference, the United Methodist Church, trying to move people beyond risk reduction to prevention. Ron and I spoke, we met at an Oasis gathering, and we spoke of beginning a local study of how mothers are treated by courts under best interest and equivalent standards. Our conversation suggested that such a study would reveal ways in which current practice allows resumption of old common law trends that enable abusers to have more access rather than less access to abusing children. We thought of possible solutions: judges and magistrates undergoing significant training as to patterns of prevention, adoption of other standards for deciding custody, and or preferential presumptions toward women that reflect current statistics of abuse and prevention more accurately. We have in the past had preferential options toward women and young children that have been thrown out of pretty much every jurisdiction in the country at this point. I do not imagine for a moment that these ideas would be received without controversy. The men's rights lobby has become very strong. Interesting name for that too, science fiction there. I also realize that some women can abuse, and each case requires thorough investigation. However, the fact is that the current standards have a dismal record of failure in domestic violence and sexual violence. And sexism is not the elephant in the room, it's the herd of elephants in the elevator. Gratefully, I look at SAVE and see this courage to speak out about this reality and to speak out and tell the truth to power. This conversation may go in a lot of directions today, and you may each bring your gifts of insights. Finally, I want to share with you that when I began in my early career, I was a pastor in Northern Appalachia before I went to law school, and I was inspired to go to law school because when I would go to this little country church, oftentimes I would meet someone who was recovering from an attack, and I would spend most of the day in the hospital. I realized I didn't really have much to offer in the way of support, so that's one of the reasons why I went to law school. I realized that I was insufficient, and going to law school didn't make me any more sufficient. Hopefully it gave me something to do that I could help. But I think what helps us, because we all feel insufficient, what helps us is the fact that we have this. We have community. We have the dance. It is our gathering and our working together that we begin the journey from trauma to wholeness, also recognizing that trauma continues. Each year in this state, at a small country church, they recognize the lives of people who have died due to intimate partner violence in this little church, a little country church. Their names are given to people in the church, and those people carry, the church people carry the names and keep the person's families and the person in their prayers. The lives are remembered. When I helped prepare for this service the past year, I looked for the obituaries and remembrances of 31 victims who died in 2012 in the state of Oregon. And I was reminded of how our society forgets victims. And I'm using the word victims because these were not survivors, these were victims. The newspapers name the killers, and there's a lot of information about people who commit the violence. But the names of the victims and their stories are often left after one report. Their loves, their passions, their hopes, their dreams. These are seldom recognized in our conversations in our community. Of the 31 people in Oregon who died, there were still articles posted about perpetrators 2 years later, but little information about who and how the victims lived. They're not to be forgotten. And this is only possible because we live in a traumatized society. It's the way a traumatized society responds, by forgetting people who are hurt. I will close with the memory of one person from that list. The writer of this was a teenager, 13 years old, and this was his best friend who was killed by his father. Now he's 16 years old, and he said, I would like you to share this poem. I was telling him about what we were going to talk about today. He writes about his friend. I know he is with us when the breeze blows When the sun shines, when the birds sing, I know He is with us. When a guitar strums and the trees sway, when the rain falls, I know He is with us. When a dog licks my hand, when I feel a bunny's soft fur, when I ignite a fire, I know He is with us. When I look up at the stars, when I sing a powerful song, and most of all, when I say a gentle prayer, I know He is with us. Thank you, my friend, for everything. Thank you for your life. So in gratitude for the lives of the survivors, for the memories of the victims, and for the work of each of you, today we begin our conversation. Let's talk.
Telling them about what the Battered Mothers Custody Conference is. Thanks.
Actually, when I first went back there in May and battered mothers, because I was not a battered mother necessarily by my ex. I became a battered mother from the court system, and from the DHS system, and from the juvenile system, and actually 26 years ago when I first spoke out, I did in numerous amounts of media because I was raised, I didn't know about child abuse. I was raised that, you went into a court, you told the truth, you would be believed, and that was it. And that didn't happen. My daughter at 3 years old testified to a judge in private chambers and told him exactly what was going on, and he couldn't handle it. He started asking her about her Barbies and whatnot. I was in such disbelief. And I thought that by doing things like, and I have copies for everyone, by speaking out, being in Good Housekeeping, being on different shows, that it was just the American people just needed to know that this was going on and they'd stop. And so then here comes 25 years later, and I'm speaking at this Battered Mothers Custody Conference last May and apologizing to these mothers because I just thought, these atrocities would come out and people would listen and they would stop and hear these stories have just continued and continued. And you listen to women who have been raped and the child's been taken from them because they're mental and given to the rapist, for custody. You hear horrible, horrible, stories from the voices of the children and these mothers. We're labeled as hysterical. We're labeled as emotional. I had sheriffs during that time tell me, that she would react to me because I was so emotional. And I used to tell them, well, what am I supposed to do? How do you want me to react when my daughter comes home and says that Daddy has stuck his fingers in her vagina? Tell me, how do you want me to react? They didn't have an answer, but what the system taught me was to become this facade so that I could be the strong person that was out there while inside was crying. And I want to say thank you to the men that are here, because we women have been speaking out, and I really believe that it's not until the men step up and tell their counterparts and tell their sex, this is not acceptable anymore. And so I look forward to the day when I can speak in a room and it's half men, half women, or, goodness, a whole room full of men. I mean, that is amazing. And so it's been very, very difficult for me to think that it has gotten worse. And to have to listen, and help. And I have, women calling me, what can I do? And it just tears your heart because you listen to the children, err inside of the children. And instead it becomes, you speak out, you get punished. I went underground. I changed. You want me to keep talking? I mean, that's not about the Battered Mothers Custody Conference.
Well, that's a great place to pause,
okay.
Because there's the live voice. I want you to hear these voices. Some of these women, April and I met again, who are still there 4 years later, 5 years later, still don't have contact with their children because custody was removed from them and given to the abuser. So here we go. Thank you. We'll come back to the underground.
7.5 years ago, my daughters disclosed that their father was sexually molesting them. At that time, we were going through a divorce, and I had been the primary caretaker of my daughters all of their lives. I was a stay-at-home mom and did everything that they ever needed done and was a very good mother. And I'm a very good person. However, when the allegations of sexual abuse came out, the children were taken from me and given to their father, the one that they accused of sexually molesting them. I was put on supervised visitation. The more that they disclosed to supervisors and other doctors, then the more the court took them away from me until they have now not allowed me to see them at all for 6.5 years.
My husband became increasingly abusive in 2003, and I ultimately had to have him arrested for attacking me in bed while I was sleeping.
He said, I'm going to make your life hell because you left me. You're my property. You had no right to leave me. If you leave me, I'm going to put you through hell. I'm going to teach you a lesson. And after about a year, he started telling me, I'm going to take your kids away, because then he figured out that's the way he really can put me through hell.
My daughter said that she was being hurt, scared, and violated by her father, who had a judicially documented history of such problems.
He had asked our son if there was something he could change about his parents, what would it be? Our son had said, I'd like my mom to cook better food. I was vegetarian at the time. And he asked that his dad stop hitting him on the back, neck, and shoulders. Our daughter was sitting with me tubside as I was draining the tub from her brother's bath. And she had stated that whenever she takes a shower with her dad, the water drips off his penis and it looks like he's peeing. And I asked her, when was the last time you had a shower with your dad? And she said, this morning.
Every time my son got naked, whether it was in the front yard pool or in a bath or even changing a diaper, my husband would get the camera and start filming.
My daughter's 2.5. She comes home from unsupervised visit with her father. And she says her bottom hurts, and I take her to a doctor. The doctor examines my daughter, and my daughter says, don't put your fingers in there. And the doctor says, why? Has anyone put their fingers in there? And she said, my daddy did.
The physical examining doctor spread my daughter's legs apart, pointed to her vagina, and asked her, did anybody ever touch you down there? And my daughter said, as a little 7-year-old, spontaneously, yes, my daddy used to. That was the end of it. That was the end of all normality.
Most people that know him think he's a really nice guy. He runs marathons for charity, and he's a top manager at a local newspaper.
He is an attorney. He's an elected politician from a community of 1 million people.
I thought when I met my husband that, wow, this is someone that's sensitive and sweet and a romantic, a poet. He's soft, He was more gentle. There's no way in hell he's ever going to hurt me.
He was Mr. Yummy when he was, Mr. Yummy, talking to all the nurses, schmoozing all the nurses, and all the nurses are coming in and telling me how great my husband is and how lucky I am, when as soon as they leave the room, he's sitting next to me masturbating under his jacket, and I'm in full-blown labor.
I had no idea this was going on until it happened to me. Not even a clue. I lived a regular life. I had a regular job. I was a regular mom.
I am what I've come to realize a typical battered mom. It does seem to be remarkable how many women are bright, articulate, educated. I was those things. I had a really respectable job when I met my husband. I was involved in politics, knew the governor well, had a political position. I lobbied for a state agency, was well respected, owned a home, drove a nice foreign car, traveled, had all those nice little things in life. I met my husband. He swept me off my feet. We were married before I can blink my eye. Before I knew it, he was battering.
People say, well, didn't you see the signs? And it's just like, no, not before I married him. He was caring, and he was like the rescuer type. I never thought in a million years that he would ever do this.
When we initially went into the shelter, I didn't see myself as a battered woman. 2 weeks prior to going in, I donated maternity clothes and kids' clothes and all sorts of items, thinking I'd like to volunteer here someday. And then 2 weeks later, we were wearing our old clothes and playing with our toys.
I fought that back and forth, that personal battle within myself. Do I try it? Do I stay? Do I leave? Do I make that jump, that leap? One day, when my son was about 3 months old, I saw him violently shake him. And I thought, there's my decision. I have to go.
I want them to understand that when they tell victims to leave, that they're frequently having them jump from the frying pan into the fire.
Once we physically remove ourselves from the harm, in a lot of ways it gets worse.
I got to the court and filed for divorce against my abusive husband. And then it's all started, that instead of living in a hell with abuser at home, I started living for the hell created in a court.
None of the domestic violence things were dealt with at trial because they basically said, you tell people this happened to you, they're going to think you're a nut.
They have this preconceived notion, it's against you before you get into that courtroom. There's something wrong with these judges.
They look for the woman to be the bad person, and they completely mitigate and ignore all the evidence that's before them about just how violent these men are.
I'm held to a higher standard than her father is held to, and basically within the court system there has never been accountability.
I break down once I'm emotionally unstable. If I go seek a therapist for, to help me out for a moment for 2 sessions, then I'm crazy, or if I took up a second job and now I'm a workaholic who I never see my children, so everything is used against me.
My attorney tried to get me to settle, and I said, no, he's abusive. And my attorney claimed that all women claim abuse. I wasn't very happy with that. And the law guardian tried to get me to settle and said, well, you're young enough to have other children. Just give him the children.
We got tape-recorded conversations of the abuse and violations of orders of protection, and the judges didn't care. And I was very confused. Why wouldn't they care? I'm offering them evidence, and the only reason we had it on tape is because the first time he abused her, the judge said, I don't believe you. You're an angry woman going through a divorce.
Well, if anyone would have told me, I would have never believed them. If somebody told me I was going to lose not only custody, but all communication, I'd have bet them any amount of money that they were wrong. How can you have 3 court orders, 3 orders of protection, affidavits attesting to the violence, police reports naming the father as the offender, and a child saying she's being violated or scared in some way, and they take her from me?
Women of domestic violence are encouraged, even on the court websites, to leave these guys, to get safe, to get their children safe, because the children are being abused. My children are very emotionally abused. When you get to the court system, they don't let you leave the guys. They keep you tethered to them.
Every time I went to court, there was just something more dire that came out of it. So I went to every local station in Atlanta. I went to the newspapers, every paper that I could.
I was calling up the major media. They were telling me, oh, this goes on all the time. I said, but nobody knows that. You're not doing stories about that. Then they further tell me, we're not allowed to.
I extended my outreach then to all of the news magazines, to Oprah and to 48 Hours, and every person that I could find on the internet that had anything to do with talk radio, talk TV, I sent my story. I couldn't get anybody to respond.
They're emotionally beat up, they're financially beat up, they're legally beat up, and the last kick in the teeth from the judges to take their children.
Emotionally, I'm drained. Physically, I'm drained. And I thought that if I did this, And I went to court and told them why I was doing it. That someday she would look at me and say, Mama, you tried every way you can.
We go through life and we celebrate their first steps, their first tooth they lose, but we never celebrate their last. And it's funny because I'm not able to celebrate either right now. And I don't think I would have ever thought about celebrating their last if I wouldn't have missed it.
I have the Air Medal. I flew in Desert Storm 15 missions to the Persian Gulf as a C-5 flight engineer. So you would think that they would treat a returning veteran with a little more respect and give a little more credibility to someone who has served her country for 27 years and also as a letter carrier for 19 years, rather than an abuser.
I was an international athlete, so I represented this country in the Olympic trials twice. I was in the military, hurt my knee in Iraq the first time around. So I'm a disabled veteran, and I guess what just really throws me is that I feel like the Constitution and everything this country's made up on has let me down when I felt I've given so much back.
I want to change the system so it doesn't happen to our children and our children's children, because if it's this bad now, what's going to happen in 20 years? This is the best kept little secret of the family courts, the best kept dirty little secret of the family courts, because it works for the courts.
I believed in a system that I've discovered doesn't work at all. And I just find that was the second re-victimization, to be completely disillusioned. I believed my husband when he said he would destroy me and he would try to move my children far away from me where I would never see them again. I believed that when I got into the court system that it would protect me, and it failed miserably.
I want them to be heard. I want them to have a voice. I want them to be safe. That's why I left. I've never asked the court to protect them for me. I've asked them to allow me to protect them, and they've done nothing of the sort.
Going through this, going through the marriage with a man who was so verbally abusive, and then finding that he had abused my children, and then fighting for the lives of my children, has devastated me. And then for 6.5 years, not seeing my daughters at all and knowing that there was someone who has hurt them and continues to hurt them and separate them from the only love that they've ever known, has just ripped me to shreds. I don't stop thinking of my children. It's very, very hard to get on with your life when you know that there is no finality here. If my children had died, I would be grieving and I would be thinking of my children, but I would have been able to go forward. But because my children live, and I love them, and I know that they're in harm's way still, I can't go on with my life. I have to continue fighting.
If you want to share that with colleagues, you simply Google Battered Mothers Custody Conference, Garland Waller. Garland Waller is a professor of film and media at Boston University and a great ally, as Jack is, as Jack's colleague Barry Goldstein is, as Warren is, in this work. And her full-length film, No Way Out But One, about another mother who went underground, as many women do, trying to protect her child, is on the back shelf if you want to look at that. So, the amazing little Malala, we know that the Taliban shot the wrong little girl, or exactly the right little girl, because she's become such a spokesperson, right, for justice. And so I feel that there's strength being given to these people who are traumatized by their own experience, Paula and Mandy and April and the women in this video, to go ahead and find the courage, even if their voices are shaking, to speak up. So there's hope on the horizon. I just know it. So, Jack, would you like to begin the panel, if you don't mind coming up? And yeah, we'll go back to hearing some background from Jack Straighten, and then some personal stories.
I feel awkward because April was in the middle of telling her story, and
But you know, I think it'll be
Okay.
perfect, because I think if you give some more background, it'll work, and you'll pick up where, at the point at which you're doing your undergrad.
So my name is Jack Straighten, and let me tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this work. In 1985, when I was getting my PhD at the University of Oregon, there were, the Women's Resource Center there asked if there were any men on campus who wanted to form a Men Against Rape group, because there had been a number of rapes on campus. And so I phoned in and gave my name. I thought it was probably a good idea, and waited for somebody to start the group. And 1 month passed, and 2 months passed, and 3 months passed, and finally in January of 1985 I went in and asked them what was up, and they handed me a list of 10 names. And so I realized at that point that I was the one who needed to start the group. And interestingly enough, you know, I was a shy kid all my life, and the idea that I would be some sort of activist around these issues was the farthest thing from my mind. But I really had a passion for human beings, and female human beings as well as male ones, and realized that nothing was being done, so something needed to be done by somebody, and I guess that meant me. So we started with a group of, I guess about 6 of us met for the first time, and a couple of them wanted to form an escort service to make sure women would be safely transported across campus, and 4 of us thought that maybe that was not sufficient social change. So the Eugene Rape Crisis Network had some dealings with men who wanted to do some anti-sexist activism, and they had a very poor outcome with those men. And so Nadia Telzi, when I approached her with the idea of helping us learn what we needed to know, she was the director at the time. She was frankly skeptical that men had any role in this, because she'd been burned before by men who wanted lots of praise for little work. But she gave us a chance, and indeed we stepped up and started doing good work. And the group in Eugene, you know, went from 4 to 15 to 23 to 7 to 1 to 8, as these groups will do. But continued for quite some time after I left and moved on to Washington, D.C., where I started a Men Against Rape group as well. And that group actually has survived through a couple of incarnations. D.C. Men Against Rape turned into the Men's Rape Prevention Project for a few years, because they didn't want to be against something, they wanted to be for something, but then the acronym Mr. PP was not working for them. So changed the name to the current one of Men Stopping Rape, Men Can Stop Rape, and they are currently doing fabulous work. There's the Men of Strength programs that are all around the country, and we've seen some billboards produced. And the nice thing about all of that is I didn't have to do all of that 20 years of work. All I needed to do was to start one group that kept on flowering and transforming itself. So in the process of all of that, I became connected with an organization which is now called the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. And it was amazing to me to have been sort of the lone firebrand in Eugene, trying to get things going. Actually, I guess I should say, interestingly enough, I found that I was a firebrand. You know, for being a boy so shy he would not ask his best friend for a glass of water at age 8, to, you know, when the television cameras would turn on, I would start stepping forward rather than running away. It was really surprising to me that I had that capability, because there's nothing in my background that would have predicted that. So really my message to you all, to give to the young men that you know, is, you know, give it a chance. You actually might be really good at this. So in Washington, D.C. in 1988, 87, I fell in with this group of national activist men and walked into this room that was this size, filled with men doing nothing but working on ending men's violence, primarily domestic violence. There are 2 or 3 of us who are working on rape issues, and several working on ending pornography and prostitution. And it was just an overwhelmingly wonderful experience to be, a small voice in a room full of that much power. And shortly thereafter, it became really clear that there was a huge backlash against women's rights coming from the male lobby. I don't use the word fathers' rights groups because I think it's really, a misrepresentation of what's going on. Father rightists might be a better word, but the male lobby is what they do. And I'm not sure that everyone involved is a former batterer, but the consciousness that comes with that group is one of domination, humiliation, and control, which is the classic dynamic of batterers. So in 1988, I proposed a task group for the National Organization for Men Against Sexism on child custody issues, and we began the work of trying to get a different conversation in the public sphere than was going on at the time. And I have to say honestly, in terms of helping individual women over the years, I'm not sure I have done much of anything. In terms of making an attempt, doing the best I could to get a different message out into public media, into legislatures, trying to convince some judges over the years. But it's a tough process, with a lot going against all of us who do this work. And one of the reasons for this is that sexism, we often think of sexism and racism as individual pathologies, that there is some man who needs to go to therapy, and if he got therapy, then he would be fixed and everything would be well. But sexism is like capitalism and socialism. It is a worldview, a consciousness, a way of viewing the world, backed up by institutional power, like capitalism and socialism are. So if we think of sexism as an individual pathology, we're missing entirely the point. And so when we see sexism at work in the court systems, it becomes most vividly an institutional issue, more than we see in many other situations. And so it's not surprising to me that this is such a tough battle, which has not been solved since April has first fell into the pits of hell, because sexism is a huge institution, not necessarily consciously ranged against good-hearted people, at the very least filled with institutional molasses and inability to think beyond what has always been. So I have been working a lot more on ending racism lately, and thought about, is there anything about the lessons that I've learned in talking about racism that I could bring into the room today? And I'm just wondering, not being in the fire pit of the courtroom, whether any of this would be effective there, perhaps with the media, but I think we need to start talking about the consciousness of male supremacy, because you think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving, in, when was it, the 80s or so, again, women got together and changed the public discourse on drunkenness and drunken driving. And there was a time period in which it would be bizarre to imagine, a society in which drunken driving is now something that is, a horrific crime. And so is there any way in which we can reframe these issues, that there will be a change in consciousness, and try to mold these systems that are, founded in sexism and peopled by sexist human beings? Can we change all of this? And, I think there's a possibility if we start talking about the consciousness of male supremacy. And let me tell you what I mean by male supremacy. Someone like me who has been working on these issues now for nearly 30 years might be the sort of person you would imagine is free of sexism. You know, I grew up in a family with a father who fought against religious persecution, and a mother who fought to prevent poverty and against racism. And so there's something about the modeling of being a champion of justice that was infused in who I am. And having been instructed in my career as an activist from people like Nadia Telzi and Mackenzie Touré in Washington, D.C., and countless others, you would think that someone like me would be the one who would be free of sexism. And that's absolutely not the case. As much as I fight the sexism, the culture continues to fill my mind with distasteful thoughts. Just a few months ago, I had a conversation with a young woman who was to be a doctor. She was in medical school to be a doctor, and she was finding herself struggling with her professors and her colleagues at the medical school, who were always placing her in a category that met her media image as a woman with a particular look. And she was expressing how frustrating this was. And I was sitting there in my mind, practically in tears, realizing that I was viewing her the same way. And I'm a man who has had female doctors since I was age 8. And yet still, it's so easy to slip into the consciousness of male supremacy. And let me tell you what I mean by male supremacy, and that is, I am someone who, I have to work myself up to pull a splinter out of my finger or someone else's, And so, nevertheless, in my private consciousness, I am nevertheless willing to sit in judgment of a woman who does have skills to be a doctor. I know less, and am willing to judge those who know more. That is the consciousness of male supremacy. So, if you want to know who is a sexist, you've got one sitting in front of you. So I think when we approach the courts, approach individuals in the courts, we have to understand that we may have allies in those situations, but many of us most of us who are male in the society take on the messages that abound. I mean, we look out in the media and we see women's bodies selling motor oil, and we see women's bodies selling vodka. And, we have a political system in which women are trying to get their representation in legislatures up to 15%, despite the fact that women are 51% of the population. We have, you can go down to the corner store and buy images of women in degrading situations sold as entertainment for men. That's the consciousness of the society we live in. Imagine if we had a world in which you could go down to the corner store and buy images of African Americans or Native Americans in horrific positions sold as entertainment for whites. There would be some outcry about that, right? And yet somehow the consciousness of male supremacy that pervades our society is norm. So it shouldn't be all that surprising that things are at the position that they are. And so very likely the word male supremacy is not going to fly all that well in a court situation. So we need to think about what language is going to fly. And, talking about how we are enmeshed with the paterfamilias might be some good Latin terminology that lawyers could relate to, So talking about all of this in a new way may help a little bit. So, when the father's lawyer comes into the courtroom with all of his stuff, maybe it's appropriate that we talk about, we have to be aware that our enmeshment with the idea of fatherhood is keeping us from an unfiltered exploration of the realities and failings of this particular man. You know, that's kind of to roll off the tongue. Maybe it would be hard to do, but who knows? Maybe we need to even start a campaign to get pater enmeshment syndrome included in the DSM-6 when it comes out as a widespread mental illness lying along the delusion axis. I mean, so I guess the other thing that I wanted to say, sort of the last bit in all of this, is a strategic part, because, you know, we get, you know, I'm very emotionally caught up in this today from the film we saw, and, you know, from April's story. She was starting to tell it, and the so many stories that I've heard over the years. My tendency in the 1980s, when I was a rabid anti-sexist activist, was, you know, out there on the streets with my fist in the air, scolding those people out there for being sexist. And, you know, first of all, this created a myth in which there was one good person, me, and one bad person, him, that was the problem. And, you know, over the years, of course, I realized that was not good for me to create that myth, because I have my own sexism I need to work on continually. But also, it did not have the desired effect on the men that I talked to, or the women who were colluding with them in their behavior. And so I have taken to talking about sexism and racism in a different way lately, which is to, you know, say, you know, isn't this fascinating how all of us are taught to see the world in these sorts of ways, and, you know, that this is how sexism works in our lives, and, you know, give the example of the particular thing that happened, and, you know, try to have a conversation around how interesting this is, and are there any alternatives to this point of view, so that when I'm in the conversation with someone around that, it's much harder for him to get defensive because he's not being labeled as sexist. We're just exploring this interesting terrain. And I do know that interesting for me in my mind is, you know, devastation for a particular woman who's being battered, but somehow the terminology in that moment may be useful. And sort of the last bit in this is understanding that we need to talk in ways in which we understand that much of what men learn about society, and women who who have taken on that same consciousness, much of what we learn without our consent. You know, I did not go out and get a degree in sexist life. You know, that was not my goal in life, to learn how to be a domineering, humiliating, and controlling human being. You know, my goal has always been to be a nurturing human being, like my beautiful father. So for me to feel shame or guilt around that is, first of all, it's unproductive, because it'll, you know, close me down. I'll have you all take care of me. All the women in the room can take care of me, because I feel so shameful, so guilty about having all of my sexism. Wouldn't that be helpful to you all? So it's not helpful, and also, you know, to realize that it's not something I asked for is just bare truth, and so I should not feel any guilt for it. And I can, if I set aside the guilt, then I can get to work and do something about changing the world for better. So thank you very much for your attention.
thank you all for being here today. You're all doing great work in the world, and I feel really honored to be chosen to be up here because I think any of you could be up here and talk about the great things you're doing in the world. So what I want to talk about today is I was abused overseas in a foreign country, and I escaped back to the United States, and the abuse was horrific. I'm not going to go into the abuse. I shouldn't be here. I should be one of those pictures right there on that billboard. And as I said, I am a survivor. I'm not a victim. And I feel very grateful for that. So I escaped, and I came back to the United States. I thought, I'm American. My kids are American. I'm home. I'm done. I'm finished. Right? What do you think? So that made a lot of sense to me. So I stayed at my sister's house, and I got a lawyer. My brother paid for a lawyer, and we served him with, divorce papers and custody papers in Dubai. And then my lawyer called me and said, he's fighting you for jurisdiction. And I was like, what does that mean? He says that he's going to fight you to take the children back to Dubai to determine custody in Dubai. And I said, you've got to be explicit. You're kidding me. And she said no. And I couldn't believe that someone so abusive and so bad had the right to try to force my American children back to a foreign country. Then he came to the United States, he came to Oregon, and he demanded to see the kids. And I told my lawyer, absolutely not. And she said, if you don't let him see the kids, you're going to look uncooperative. And I said, look, uncooperative, I am uncooperative. How can this man have access to these children to be emotionally, psychologically, physically, and sexually abused? But because the abuse occurred in a foreign country, it was a he said, she said situation. So he came here to Oregon, demanded to see the kids. I had to leave my sister's house because he hired a private investigator to find us. And I let him see the kids supervised. About an hour after the supervised visit, the manager of the hotel that I was staying in called me and said, Paula, your husband's in the lobby. So the kids and I bolted out the back door, and we were in hiding for 6 months. We lived like gypsies along the Oregon-California coast. I was homeless, fighting for jurisdiction. Now I had Judge Sealander of Clackamas County, and he awarded me jurisdiction in Oregon in September of 1999, 6 months after I had come back. My ex did a writ of mandamus to the Oregon Supreme Court to say that Judge Sealander had ruled incorrectly, and the Oregon Supreme Court upheld Judge Sealander's decision. So now I was in Oregon. I'm done, right? I have jurisdiction. I have custody. I don't have custody of my kids. I still have to fight for custody, but of course the courts are going to give me custody because he lives in Dubai and I live in Oregon. No jurisdiction for alimony or child support, which was fine. So I went into a transitional housing program, and he starts fighting me for custody. And I said, how can he fight me for custody when he doesn't even live in the state? And they said, oh, because he's going to buy a house in Lake Oswego. I'm like, he's not going to buy a house in Lake Oswego. This is not going to happen. So about a year after I get back, and I wrote a book. I have it in the car. I can bring some in. So about a year and a month after I get back, I'm sitting in my little transitional housing apartment, and my lawyer gives me an envelope, and it comes in the mail. So I'm going to read this little part. I'm sitting on the living room floor in late June, opening a large envelope I received in the mail from Lois, my lawyer. Inside is an Islamic divorce decree in Arabic, translated into English. Wow, I think out loud. Ty divorced me last month in Dubai. Then I look again at the date, May 23rd, 1999. May 1999, 1 month after I fled. Ty was still sending me love letters, begging me to come back to him in June of 1999. Funny, he never submitted the decree to his lawyer. He even used his American passport as his form of identity, giving him more respect in the courts than a Palestinian refugee would receive. I read the decree silently, then out loud in disbelief. I hereby confirm the divorce of Tysir DeSanti from his wife, Paula Marie Lucas, a first revocable divorce. Therefore, as long as she is within her viduity period, he may take her back without her consent and without a new contract and dowry. She may start her viduity period as of the date of the divorce. What the hell is a viduity period? So if I hadn't have had 3 menstrual cycles, he could have taken me back without my consent if I was still living in the UAE. Now, Judge Sealander saw this, luckily, and so after, we had to go through a custody evaluation. After all this, and the custody evaluator came back, and there was two things that struck me on his evaluation. Number one, I was called histrionic, that I had exaggerated, my difficulties, and number two, that my oldest son had spontaneously disclosed sexual abuse during the custody evaluation, but he wasn't going to report it to the courts because if he did, it would seal any possibility of my ex-husband having contact with the children.
What? That's illegal for him not to report.
Yes, it's illegal for him not to report. That was my custody evaluation. So I did end up getting full legal and physical custody of my children. Judge Sealander gave me that in September of 2000, a year and a half after I came back. Still no jurisdiction for alimony or child support. My ex was given supervised visitation, and the next 3 years were hell because he was demanding unsupervised visitation. We went back and forth in the courts, and I just stuck to my guns and said, absolutely not. You will not get unsupervised visitation of these children. And eventually, luckily, he went away. He just disappeared for 2 years, and then he came back. But that's another story. So I do feel very lucky. And then in all of this, I decided that my little piece of the world was going to start an organization that helps other American women and children being abused in foreign countries, and that's what I do today. I did write a book, Harvesting Stones, an international journey of American women's international journey of survival. I can't remember the name of my book. And I've got some in the car, and I'll bring them in later. So thank you.
I know. You tell them. But everyone's going to be staring at you because you're so cute. Do we need a break or something? Okay. So I had started my story, and like I had said, I never ever once thought in my life that you would go into a court and that they wouldn't believe you. When all of this started with Manny, this was in that era when everyone was, children just tell someone, tell your teacher, tell your minister, tell someone, you will be believed. From the ages of 2 to 4, my daughter was raped by her father. And I use that word very strongly because the courts would tell me, no, it's molestation. And I would say, no, it's rape. It is rape. It's spiritual rape. It's emotional rape. It's physical rape. It is sexual rape. He's distracted. Seriously. So, ages 2 and 4, 4 years old, and I was in the courts. Her father was fighting for custody. Her father was also dating one of the CPS workers. Her father also worked for the county. His father was also a veterinarian who had access to different medications that eventually covered up the genital warts that he gave my daughter. At 4 years old, she was diagnosed with a sexually transmitted disease. I had to get her out of California into Oregon so that she would have an expert exam. I found an attorney, and when the attorney sent all of the documentation down to California, their response was arrest warrants on me and my daughter. That was their response. And my sweet little baby, was not going back. I did everything they said. At one point, I put her in foster care so I could prove that it wasn't me just trying to get back at him, that I really wanted her protected. At 3 years old, I promised her she would never, ever, ever be hurt. That promise was broken. When your child is sitting with a baby doll, sticking pencils up the little hole that they pee in, and you're saying, what's going on? Well, that's what Daddy does to me. The first incident that she came home with in a bath, she was crying, it hurts. Well, where does it hurt? Down there. Took her out, looked, she had a cut from her perineum down to her anal opening. And I said, what happened? Daddy cut me with a knife. We took her to the Crimes Against Children's detective. She drew pictures on the knife. She told him exactly what was going on. I mean, this was 2 years. By the end of the 2 years, they were going to give him 1 week custody. I was going to have 1 week custody. I was not allowed to take her to a doctor. I was not allowed to take her to a psychologist. I was not allowed to do anything for my daughter without any permission because it was me. Now this had become a custody battle. And that was what the courts had labeled. I had made arrangements. My parents got her out and got the abuse exam because I was going to stay in California and fight it. A week away from my daughter, and there was no way. I came back up, and then when they said that they sent the arrest warrants on us, that's when we started on our underground. I was in contact with Faye Yeager from Atlanta, and I thought this children's underground had been already established, only to come to find out we were the first family that she put in. And so we traveled cross country, living with different families, hiding. Mandy would be in the back of the car, was cop car mom. I mean, we would duck. I mean, this was, I was a fugitive. If I had stolen her from the state, I now had a federal warrant out for my arrest. While I had that federal warrant, I did things like this. I went on TV shows, and they would say, "Why are you doing this?" And I would say, "Because the people of America have to know what is going on." 4 years. So from and then actually, when I was underground, when we left, I left with a gentleman, and to complicate things, I got pregnant underground. But part of the reason that I did was because I was terrified that when they found us, they would take her, and I wanted to have a baby. I wanted to have a daughter. And I did have another daughter underground. And then was 2 months pregnant when I was arrested by the FBI, and they had found us after 4 or 5 years living. I had a new identity. Mandy was in school. Pulled her out of school. I mean, it became horrific. Juvenile trials. I had a 2-month-long criminal trial in front of a 12-person jury. And all this time, you report this, you're in family court. This is a crime. I would have sheriffs who would listen to her, and they would come in and go, "A crime's been committed." And I'd look at them and go arrest the perpetrator. But all of these cases end up in family court. It's not, if a stranger molests your child or rapes your child, guess what? That's in criminal court. But if it's in, incest, or if it's familial, you're in family court. And they control you and stuff. I did every single thing that, that they had asked. The custody evaluations. He failed the sexual abuse, test that they had done. He failed the lie detector test. But that didn't stop. So after 4 years of being underground, was arrested. We were brought back, and now went through courts. They never said that her father abused her, but they said that her maternal bond was so strong with me that they were going to put her back that I would have custody of her, and that they just could not understand why I would refuse to let her see him. And they would punish me, saying that, he's a parent, he has parental rights. I'd say she's a child, she has child rights. I had the social worker say, even murderers get to visit. I mean, even, murderers see their children. And I would look at her and say, murderers don't visit their victims, though. I mean, were you going to put an 18-year-old woman, in a room with the person that's raped him and said, "It's supervised, sweetie. It's okay. You're okay." What messages is that sending to these children? What messages, right? Oh, you're protected as long. And then these fathers would bring in, different things to the visits that would remind them and stuff. So, 12 years old, Mandy gets her own attorney. We're back in court because her father wants, custody. They would not let her have her own attorney. She testified, "If you make me go live with my father, I'm going to run away." Mandy went back into the underground at 13. I did not see her for 2.5 years. She was hidden again. When I saw her, she was when I did get to see her after 2.5 years, she was in the first stages of anorexia. And to me, that's a cry for help. And at that point, we brought her back to Oregon, my family. She was still under another alias. We put her in school, but she still couldn't be with me until she was 18 because of the statute of limitations. And now she's been taken. I had 3 other children, so when she left her 2 sisters and a brother. I have tons. I mean, I have, of court documents. But what's more distressing are the letters that are written from my daughter to me when she was gone and from me to her. Every single entry at the end is, "Mom, I just want to come home. Please just let me come home." She'd contact her father through the child abuse hotline where they were trying to match up. And the people on the other end and she would just say, "Just let me come home, live with Mom, just let me," and he would say no. And the people on this line are like, "Are you serious? You have a child run away, and this is what you're telling your daughter?" So literally until the age of her being 21, because the statute of limitations didn't run out for me until then, so they could have recharged me with parental kidnapping, which is what they charged me with, because when I left the state, she was in the custody of the Child Protective Services. So they said I stole her from the state. And so they didn't like that I kept opening my mouth. And I still open my mouth. The repercussions from all of this have been, to this day, someone, if I answer the phone, I mean, I've had FBI, the trust is gone. People, if there's something different on the phone, I'm like, "Who is this? Is this April? Is this April?" And it's like, who wants to know? Okay? Because it is the most terrifying. And it's most terrifying as a mother when you cannot protect your child.
Thank you so much. So much. My goodness. And thank you for mentioning the institutional betrayal trauma that's added.
Oh, it's horrible.
And the consequences of that. Really. And so here you are. Oh my goodness. You're an epiphany star.
Wow. I don't have a ton to add, but focusing kind of on the way the system ends up battering. Like when I think back on the things that I get the most upset about, I don't get angry about what my father did to me. I don't really know why. I get angry about that no one listened, and that for years and years I was told, oh, when you're 9, that's when they'll listen to you. Oh, no, okay, now when you're 10. Oh, when you're 11. Oh, when you're 12. And it was constantly moving that timeline forward for me. And to hire my own attorney and then have them say, you don't have the right to fire your court-appointed attorney and hire the one that you want. I think I was, you grow up thinking that you're in America, that there's justice, and maybe that's why was the biggest betrayal to me. It was thinking that, I'm a huge reader and have read my whole life, and the bad guys are supposed to lose and the good guys are supposed to win, and that's what's supposed to happen. And then you enter a court system where that's all out of your control, and that doesn't necessarily always happen. And I was, I think, 9 when you do the Pledge of Allegiance in school, and I would stop saying the liberty and justice for all part because I didn't see that, and I wasn't going to say it if it wasn't happening. But
and sometimes it's a mistake to do the work you do. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, now I'm a supervisor at DHS down in Eugene, and I think it's where I come from in my work is just to really focus on listening to what the kids have to say, and my focus is that, and trying to realize that what we're here to do is to serve children and make sure that they're safe and happy. And a lot of times that's with their parents, and we need to make sure that we figure out a way for that to happen. But keeping in mind, and I am pleased to see that, you know, and when I've been working, the attorneys and everything that I've worked with, they'll represent what their client, the child, wants from a very young age, as soon as that child's able to verbalize it. And so for me, that's a huge relief, because that never happened for me. I had my court-appointed attorney tell me that my father was a really nice guy and that they knew what was best for me and that I'd be going to live with him. And so I'm pleased to see that that is changing, that the child doesn't have to be a certain age before what they want is put out there in court. I think, and that's just kind of where I come from.
I just want to add something too, because there's so many people from so many different organizations here. You can get my phone number, I can give it to you from Rhonda. I have no problem speaking.
If I could just remind you to try to speak up. I'll try to repeat your question. Feel free to correct me if I get it wrong, because I don't always hear things well. So please, amazing panel, amazing courage and amazing insight. So please feel free. Now they're going to give you the gift of being able to ask them a question as well. So. Yes.
Hi, Chris Jones, and a question for you, Jack. Do you work with, and are you aware of the EPIC group, Every Man Protecting Innocent Kids in Portland?
No, I'm not.
Oh, can we talk about it later?
Yes.
It's a really wonderful thing. They're working with Portland Police and in rescuing kids that are being sold into pimps and through trafficking. And I just wanted to talk to you about that.
Okay, that's good to hear about.
Yes.
Have you found, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Directly to April,
Yeah,
for like eye to
you're loud
eye.
enough. Go for it.
Have you found, and I kind of ask this from a personal standpoint, that your involvement with DHS and the state has carried over to a grand array of other parts of your life?
Yes.
And how have you dealt with that?
I don't deal with it very well. If you ask all my kids, they'll still tell you, you know, I'm a mama bear. For all of this that they, you know, controlled me and kept me emotionally, I tend to have this anger spot where I get, in a minute, it can become so frustrated at just the lack of common sense and just, are you serious? I mean, wouldn't you err on the side of a child? And then they used to tell me, well, we can't put her on the stand because one of the first questions they'll ask her is if she believes in Santa Claus. And if she says yes, you know, and at 3 or 4, then that means that, you know, that she's, you know, is not credible. So I have a totally different view of DHS than the child protective services, because they lied, they battered me, and it's in total agreement with her. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I was kind of wondering more, did you have struggles? I don't know a lot about, you know, your life now and the work you've pursued. I'm just wondering if you've had struggles with your case stopping you from achieving different things in your life.
Like your
yes,
criminal history.
yes,
yeah, your criminal history,
well,
DHS history.
I was 2 weeks when I left with her. I was 2 weeks away from getting my teaching credential, and so career-wise, you know that I had a student loan. You know, they're still after me for $30,000 now because when I was, you know, went underground, I couldn't pay my student loan, and they don't care. They don't care why, you know, you were underground. The emotional battery, you know, that occurred, and because I can become very emotional, it's like, really, where are the tissues, you know, next to anything. So I have to say, it's just the total distrust of people, and it's like, if someone says that they're going to help, or someone, you know, it's my trust of people.
Okay, back here, and
Just
then,
kind of a follow-up. So, Mandy, if something happened to you and your child had to be placed in foster care, your mom wouldn't be able to be certified to be his placement, right?
You know, I'm not sure. Her criminal history, I mean, there might be able to be an exception made. You know, they do look at making exceptions, but it would be tough. It wouldn't be like, oh yeah, automatically grandma can be certified.
And I assume she'd probably be your top choice.
Yes.
For a caregiver for
Yes.
your son.
Yeah.
So that way, if
That's
that's
kind of exactly
keep,
where
keeps going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was never convicted of anything, and interestingly enough, when the jury was out for 3 days.
Oh my.
The judge and they sent me, I had to drive an hour to court. They sent me to a totally different court because they were sending me to the prosecutor's judge. And they knew I was going to go to jail for 2 years. The DA used to come by and say, we're sending you to Lesbian Row. Just want you to know that. Seriously, those were the types of things that I was hearing. The judge was in chambers while the jury was out, and if they convicted me, the judge was going to overturn it. Because we had to prove 6 points of why I ran. Because I had done it. I had taken her and stuff, but we had to prove the 6 reasons why I was justified in taking her. And I had an awesome attorney, and so we were able to do that. But the judge came out in the paperwork or in the papers and said that if it had been him, he would have run sooner, and that the legal system had failed me.
Nice random sense, you know. Just
Yeah.
Well, and your CPS history is all in California too.
Yeah.
That helps.
April and Paula, your stories are so awesome, really. And I commend you, Jack, for your work with Men Against Sexism. I wanted to ask this question of you, Jack. What's happening in your experience, in your direct experience with young men today? Are they growing in number who care about joining Men Against Sexism? What is your sense?
so the question over here, what's happening with young men, just in case?
So when I first started doing education in schools in 1985, 86, what would happen would be there would be a row of 19 men in the back of the room with this posture, totally bored with the whole thing. And very interestingly enough, in 95 or so, I went back to Eugene with some other colleagues in Portland to try to jumpstart Men Against Rape again, because it had died in the meantime. And so I went to the Take Back the Night rally, and asked the men there, instead of marching with your partners, come and let's do something else together. And we had 75 men come into the room. It was overwhelming, and we split them up. Those who wanted to work on prostitution and pornography, those who wanted to work on child custody, those who wanted to work on domestic violence, those who wanted to work on sexual assault, those who wanted to work on sexual harassment. We had 5, 6 huge groups, each of which was going to go forward with their work. And so 10 years later, there had been a pretty substantial change. 10 years past that, I was teaching a college course at high school level, Westview High School, in 2003 or so, 2005, and it happened to be April, so this was Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I guess, or Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April. And so we had been doing, I had been doing a lot of anti-racist training with them over the year, and maybe there was a carryover from one oppression to the other. But I just came in the room and briefly mentioned that it was Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and I had a bag full of buttons and passed them around the room. And so 65 students in the first group, the first class, male and female, everyone took out a button and put it on. And then I got to the second section 2 hours later, and the bag went around the room, and the last 4 men were pissed because there were no buttons left. And so, I see that as a very hopeful sign. I know that there has been, ups and downs around the whole Occupy movement, because there was a moment where it really felt like maybe there is going to be another movement, started and peopled by young people. And indeed, the occupiers are working sort of more behind the scenes, and things are going on in this community around, trying to keep people in their houses and whatnot. So that remains to be seen. But I think I'm a hopeful person. Let me just stop with that.
Come right back to you. May I make one observation? Working with college students, I agree with you on there's a lot more young men that are becoming involved, but my concern is the priorities that we're setting, mostly monetary priorities, is going to have an impact on the next generation, next 10 or 15 years, and that we may lose some of those young men. Because we have, in the city of Eugene, for instance, Women's Space has had to cut hours and no longer takes walk-ups on certain days. Sexual Assault Support Services of Lane County just announced that they no longer have walk-ups on Mondays and Fridays, Monday being the busiest day. The Women's Center at the University of Oregon, as they're redoing the Student Center, the Women's Center has been relegated to a hallway in the old basketball stadium. In the meantime, this is when Eugene and the community and also the university has been written up in the New York Times for all the new sports facilities that we have that are dedicated to male athletics. I'm very concerned. I'm excited about the men that are involved, but I think that we're sending a different message to men in general. So it's a both-ended. I'm sorry, I had to say that.
That's okay. I'm glad you
thank
did,
you.
because that's kind of my question. It was to both you and Jack. I've been an activist for 22 years in this field of child prostitution. I lived in Asia for a long time and traveled back and forth a lot. And, the situation is not that different in our country. Particularly in Portland, it's a major hub of child sex problems. And I think that the healing and the spiritual part of this that has to come it's a man-woman thing. That whole thing has to shift. What do you both see as a possibility for that occurring?
So in 1988, in Washington, D.C., a group of us decided to put on a conference on domestic violence and invited all the clergy in the city to come to that. Not a single clergy member came. And today, there's a vast difference. So I think the connection between the life of the mind and the life of the spirit and dealing with these real pressing social issues is vastly changed. So, that's a good sign.
That's great.
I think that one of the things that I'm running into is that there is not a very good consciousness of the realities of prostitution in Portland and probably around the country. 15 years ago, there was the Council for Prostitution Alternatives that was a public voice for women who had no voice. And now the only public voice that seems to be there are, women who are speaking for prostitutes who really have never been in sexual slavery for dozens of years. And so, the younger generation does not have, by younger I just mean not that a huge 15-year gap with no public messaging around what's really going on. So the younger folks are not aware of the work that all the women in the community were doing around that in the mid-1990s.
Can we open that question up? Because April and Paula, I think you were describing journeys with a tremendous spiritual resonance, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that question around Yeah, go for it, please.
Well, I guess for us, and part of the work that I'm doing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what American women face when they come back, and it's part of that whole legislative process that I think was done by males. is there something called the Hague Convention on International Child Abduction. So every time an American woman flees a foreign country and comes back to the United States from a Hague country, she is forced. The U.S. Department of State is a central authority, and so our government tries to force those women to take their American children back to foreign countries. So we're working on a legislative level now to get that changed so that they recognize that abuse to the mother is grave harm to the child, and therefore these American mothers shouldn't be forced to take their children back to a foreign country. So when I think about, Judge Sealander giving me jurisdiction, he could have, even though I wasn't from a Hague country, he could still have said no, the United Arab Emirates has jurisdiction. So I think, when you're thinking about males being involved, it's not only, I think we need male advocates, but we also need males at legislative levels, and our senators and our congresspeople who are saying, wait a minute, we need to protect battered mothers and their children, and not look at treaties and conventions between different countries as the priority, but let's look at the safety of battered women and children first, and then let's see whether or not we should comply with that treaty.
And could I jump in there, because I so appreciate you mentioning, first of all, Chris said the spiritual healing of male and female coming into balance. So Rion Eisler talks about what happens when that gets out of whack, as it is in the United States with only 19%, is that right, in our legislature of women. And nationally, we're all proud because now we have 20 senators who are women, but in countries with real gender parity, you get a different culture. And so you have these powerful, what did you call them, men rightists groups, right? That some of them are qualified as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, influencing a heavily patriarchal legislature and even more heavily patriarchal judicial system, very authoritarian. And so to look at the nuance, for example, the Hague Convention, where the truth is out there. I want to tell you that. The truth is out there if we want to see it. It's all been documented. Men kidnap to re-exert control over women who leave. Women kidnap, flee the country to try to protect their children. And so to try to just apply the Hague Convention with some kind of, neutral blinders on isn't going to work, and we need to look at that. So.
Thanks, Ron.
We're talking about spiritual?
However you interpret that to mean. For me, it just means holistic. I mean, your whole person, your whole journey here. And we're talking about healing and involving our different stories, different members of the community like this.
I'm still in the process. I'm still in the process of healing. I'm still very much in the process of healing. Throughout most of the travels and different things, I knew that there was angelic presence around. There would be totally different things that would happen. We go in and apply. I had to go in and get Social Security, card with an alias, and here I am saying I'm 28, and they didn't copy all my documentations. We would have nuns all of a sudden appear, and like when we would have to go into places and sort of surround us, and then we turn around and they be gone. They be gone. And so for me, and I never ended up having like a hatred towards men. I got married again. I had kids. It wasn't like it was, the sex. It was the person, and I don't think that the judges, and I don't, you end up having someone come stand in front of you who's in a nice suit and who looks really nice, and judges and people are looking at. That's not what in our minds what we think a molester or rapist is. We think it's the guy around the corner who looks creepy or, and whatnot. And so people have a hard time accepting that it can just be, a judge, a policeman, clergy, a fire, any of these people and stuff. So my healing is still in great process.
Thank you.
I'll just talk about my healing.
Yes,
My
go for it.
healing was forming the organization and taking my power back and helping others. So I feel I have completely healed. The book was a huge purging of a lot of trauma, which I didn't even know I had. At one point, I'm like in front of the toilet and I'm like dry heaving and I'm sobbing, and I remarried, and my husband walks into the bathroom. He's like, "Oh my gosh, what can I do?" I'm like, "This is good. This is really good," and it was. And so I think that I'd recommend writing your story down, April. Writing it, even if it's just for you, writing it down, because it takes it out of a cellular level and it purges places you didn't even know existed. So.
I keep trying,
Yes.
and it's so upsetting.
It is. It's hard.
How I met Christina Jones, became involved with the Little Sisters Foundation that she helped found. One of the things that I noticed when she was talking about her experiences was how similar the girls that went through in Nepal were to what I went through. And down to the language that these men used to the girls to get them to be controlled. I mean, it was so similar. And it was on the other side of the world. It was crazy to me that it was just so similar. A little background on me is I came from a fundamentalist community that's very insular. I was homeschooled. I didn't get to go to high school. I had to just stay with my family and with other people who are part of the community. So I didn't really have a chance to get beat down by the family court system because that was not going to be a viable option. Especially in the US, religious communities are just off the table. Nobody's going to go in there. Nobody's going to stop it. People know what's happening, but it's untouchable, you know. So that kind of sets up what I'm about to read. So this happened when I was early teenager. I walked into the youth chapel at the church. Something was different. There was a box of donuts on the folding table in the center of the room. All of us descended on it eagerly. There were some kids who had such strict parents that they did not get to eat sugar. They were the most deflated. I stared into the box, taking in donut after donut. Glazed, cream-filled maple bar, all varieties and one common theme. A big bite had been taken out of each one. We were dejected and we slumped in our chairs. No one was willing to eat a communal donut. We had been told that we would get herpes or STDs or AIDS if we shared food or anything like that. We didn't have sex education, so we didn't know. We were very good at going without, though, and withholding, because that was a hallmark of our society. And if we were really good, we would just sit there and not even look at the donuts again. We'd already gone without dancing. Dancing is forbidden. We couldn't learn science. We couldn't eat meat. We couldn't read novels. There's just a long, long list of things we weren't allowed to do. So not eating donuts, even though we really wanted sugar, they had one bite out of it, we could do that. The youth pastor finally entered the room like a Vegas magician. He was really proud of himself. I could tell he was really revving up for this one. He looked around the room, then focused his eyes on me. Once you are touched, no one will want you. No one will marry you. No one wants to eat a donut that somebody else has already taken a bite out of. They throw that donut away. They'll throw you away. All the other kids looked at me curiously. If they did not know, now they did. I was the donut. I was touched and I was impure, and he knew it. I was raped by someone this guy knew, and here he was telling me that God thought I was disposable tissue now in front of everyone. He went on and on about the virtues of virginity while I had that sensation of being swallowed up by the floor. His words began to melt together. I got up and I left the chapel. I did not return. I think that was the last time that I went to church, or right around that period of time. So I grew up and I left that community, which is why I probably did not end up like one of these people. And I met people that didn't think that being a virgin was a prerequisite for being a good person or for being a wife or any of those things. I told myself a million times that the metaphor was boring and stupid, but still at night I would dream of it. I would feel unworthy. I would remember what he said in painful detail and how he looked right at me in a room of teenagers to say it. It felt staged just to point out to the holy kids that I was not. It speaks to education on abstinence. If someone loses their hymen, we need to believe they are still worthy. Virginity as a commodity is foolish and makes vulnerable people more so out of the shame society levels on them. Who would want to raise their hand and say, well, they're the donut? Nobody would. Except for me now.